What happens when you drop a PvP veteran into Mythic Plus? How will they fare in the PvE scene? This was a question I asked myself, as I was always curious about the PvE scene, yet never got much into it. I initially wanted to see how far I could go and see just what the hype was about PvE that gets the remaining 93% of players to play it over PvP. What's up fellas, Moon here. Around a month and a half ago, I concluded my Zero to Hero series where I narrowly failed hitting Gladiator in PvP. I'll link the series here for those interested in watching how I progressed over the period of the season, and leave a chapter marker here if you want to skip solely to the Mythic Plus part of this video. Essentially, I significantly progressed and got better with the game, and in a desperate push to the finish line, I played the game for an unhealthy length of time to where it had negative effects on my physical health, mental health, work life, and personal life to the extent where I completely burned out on the game. In the process, I lost every single connection I made, surprisingly aside from Erratic's team who we faced in episode 5. So you can imagine how unbelievably foolish I felt having invested all that time, effort, and energy into something, putting myself at net negatives elsewhere in my life, and still failing a goal I had set out for myself. I'm not asking for any sympathy, as ultimately I am reaping what I sowed and taking full responsibility for my choices with what I did. It sounds corny to say, but I learned valuable life lessons through playing a video game, and I was able to get a lot of wisdom out of the ordeal. Number one is that any goal that's worthwhile takes sacrifice, even if it means making uncomfortable trades for a while. I look at the difference between myself, who was nearly 2400 rated in PvP, and the rank 1 players who crush the competition and make the AWC highlight reels we watch over and over again. The difference is that they went all in on the PvP basket, having committed an insanely large amount of playtime and practice towards perfecting that craft, and are content with dumping that much time into being the absolute best players of the game. While I admire their skill and still aspire to play like them when I do play, I find that I would rather spend those free hours in an editing software trying to make content for the game, as that's more important to me. Number 2 is that people are expendable in this game, myself included. This was one of the more painful ones to internalize and took more time to process, but it's a very sad truth about not just this game, but the online space in general. Being vulnerable with you guys here, one of my weaknesses as an individual is becoming too attached to the person on the other side of the screen. I went through several teammates throughout the duration of the series, and I took a vested interest into the people they were outside of the arena and off camera. I got to learn about where they worked, what their family life was like, what mattered to them, what fun hobbies they did outside of WoW, what the pivotal moments of their life were, what regrets they had, what wisdom they've learned, and form connections. As I am still a student to the game and of life itself, unfortunately my naivety got the better of me. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it didn't hurt, because it did, but I feel like I'm way more equipped to handle it now than I was even 6 months ago. I'm not going to air out the specifics of my dirty laundry on YouTube, but there were definitely nights where I waited for hours for people to log on only to have my time wasted. That's the thing that aggravates me the most, since time is the only currency which you can't get back. It is what it is, I suppose. Now that we've got all that out of the way, let's get into how I got into Mythic Plus. I figured Mythic Plus would be the best jump over to PvE because it's largely something that you can do solo if you absolutely had to, whereas raiding had a significantly larger social aspect to it regarding parses, finding a guild, doing an interview, and treating the game as a second job. No disrespect to raiders by any means, but it's not an idea I find appealing at all. You may be saying, Moon, you silly goose, that only happens at the Mythic level. But honestly, when I was searching for guilds, I was seeing this shit happening for even guilds just entering heroic raiding. So it was settled, Mythic Plus it was. I packed up my bags and left the rural PvP community to move to the big city. The land of opportunity, they call it. PvE. I decided to switch which healer I was playing to give myself some more variety, so I picked up my Mistweaver for a spin and started farming heroics to get enough gear for Mythic Zeros. I was actually impressed with the dungeon scaling changes, as Mythic Zero dungeons felt like something that had to be respected now, as opposed to just dungeons on Mythic difficulty that felt like normals in the past. I really liked how there was an observable spike in difficulty between the heroic and mythic difficulties. My first 1000 to 1500 points in score weren't so hard to rack up. I found that I was getting invited to low level keys with relative ease. We were having relatively easy clears on level 2, 3, and 4 dungeons without much struggle. Albeit you could tangibly feel the difference in being under-geared versus coming back with even 10 or 15 more item levels than before. The biggest surprise for myself was seeing just how many players, even as I pushed into the mid-level keys like 7s, 8s, and 9s, not know their class's utility kit or know what their defensives do. For instance, out of all of the mages I encountered, I only met one that knew what Alter Time was and used it correctly. I feel like while a lot of PvP players would use this as an opportunity to gloat about how this proves PvP is harder than PvE and that it's better, I'm actually totally okay with this being the case. World of Warcraft can be an overwhelming game for people just getting started. And I imagine that for DPS players, prioritizing learning their damage and rotation first would be the most effective for them starting out before adding other things to their mental stack like defensives and utility. If anything, I'm actually glad that PvE has a lower skill floor for success because it gives more room for players to grow in the long term. The negative side effect to this though is that it puts more strain onto the tank and healers specifically. While I'm by no means a pro at the Mistweaver healing as you see in the background, I felt like I had a good enough grasp at the lower level keys to cover for my DPS's mistakes and was able to time nearly every single key moving up from the low key range. Then we got to around the level 7 range where mechanics mattered significantly more. I noticed that my DPS players would get one shot if they messed up a mechanic and didn't use a defensive first, and no amount of raw healing throughput could compensate for an instantaneous death. Fights would also get significantly more difficult if a player were to go down and there wasn't a battle res available. My mana started to matter a little bit more too as a healer, but using Mana Tea in a smart way made it to where I still wasn't actually having to stop to drink during the key yet. I also noticed at this level that I was having a more difficult time getting into key. I would have thought that there was a healer's shortage in the PvE scene as well, but I guess I was mistaken. As I am a monk healer that has no battle res or bloodlust effect, my value compared to other healers which do bring those things drops significantly. There are some dungeons that I'll get invited to because my poison or disease dispel will come in handy, but aside from those niche cases, it became a lot more difficult to gain score. There are two workarounds to this problem, being either to meet friends to play with, or to run your own key over and over until you get the dungeon that you want. Regarding the first way, I actually made an effort to go and seek out some new friends. I joined some recruiting discords and shopped around for guilds for a while and added some people to my bnet list after keys that I thought played exceptionally well. Unfortunately, these avenues weren't fruitful for the few weeks I dedicated to this Mythic Plus journey. While I had some cool interactions running keys with pugs, I found it really difficult trying to get to play with people again due to their raid schedules, playing with their guildmates, or other things making it to where they can't play. In going the guild avenue, I had a hard time finding a guild for a few reasons. One, most guilds that were active wanted me to raid, and I didn't want to commit 2 to 3 nights a week to a raid team just to do dungeons with people. 2, it was nearly impossible to find a guild without some sort of inherent political messaging or one of the GMs or officers going on a political power rant. I found that these guilds had militant rules which were almost all political in nature, and in my opinion, it's really gross to try and infuse politics with your gaming. Maybe some people enjoy that, but I use gaming as a way to escape politics and the shit that goes on in the real world. And number 3, speaking of power trips, it seemed like almost every guild I joined had some sort of high school drama going on, and officers acting insanely power hungry. It was very much a he said, she said type of environment, combined with really obscure and immature rulings. You would think that these were young and immature players, but with the several instances I found, most of the time it's people who are well into their 30s displaying this type of behavior. That being said, I found myself unsuccessful in finding a guild that worked for me, but I don't want to rule out the possibility of things having been different if we were in a new expansion rather than being in the end stage of one, which is where we're at now. I did run my own key from time to time as well, however it got very tedious and annoying when you complete a dungeon and it rotates 4 or 5 times to a dungeon that you don't need to run for score or loot. So you're basically left with a choice to run a dungeon you don't need to do and waste time, or try to get into a group and then re-roll the key, which still puts you back at square one. I definitely empathize more with PvE players that this system is rather annoying to work around, and I think that social networking is even more important with the Mythic Plus scene because of how many players there are. In PvP, as long as you could perform somewhat decently and fit the comp you were playing in, most people would give you a shot anyways because of how few people were playing PvP. However, with Mythic Plus, I've noticed that players are a dime a dozen and a lot more classes can cover to fill certain requirements within a group. Despite the barriers, I was able to push up and approach 2500. I initially thought of setting 3000 as a score goal for myself, but after several negative experiences in a row, I figured that there's a significant diminishing return once you push past the 2500 achievement, as there's a large gap between that, the Keystone Hero level, and rank 1, with not much really between. Now, I'm gonna get rather brutal with my takes here. By far, the most off-putting aspect to Mythic Plus is the age-old adage of needing experience to get experience. I found that approaching the level 10 to level 11 Keystone range that I would get rejected from a significantly larger amount of groups because a healer that had already hit a score of, say, 3000 this season applied shortly after I did, or because I didn't already possess a score significantly higher than that of the keys I were trying to get into. Again, I am a healer and this is happening to me, so I can only imagine what it's like to be a rogue, a warrior, or a DPS monk trying to get into these groups, that it'd be even more difficult for them to do so. I think the usage of third-party tools has significantly made this problem worse over expansions, and as much as the World of Warcraft community wants to gaslight themselves into believing this issue is something that only happens to the few, the truth is that this phenomena has become the rule and not the exception. Unfortunately, this isn't a retail-specific thing, as I've heard plenty of stories regarding similar behaviors in Wrath Classic, and even Zico, who's a well-renowned PvP player, has videos on his channel about this stuff happening in Season of Discovery. This significantly hinders the progress of those who are either newer to the game or those who had a late start to the season, which sets a weird precedent that if you want to be viable or get invited to groups in the season, you have to play a lot and push super hard super early, or else you'll be fighting an uphill battle for the whole season. I also noticed that player temperaments were getting significantly worse the higher I went to. Like in lower to mid-lower keys, a lot of players knew that they weren't exceptional at the game, but were at least friendly and willing to learn. Whereas these mid to mid-high level keys, I encountered more players that had this weird mentality that they deserved to be in the MDI and it was everyone else's fault that they weren't there. I've had multiple dungeons where one player made a mechanical error or forgot to press a defensive which resulted in their death, blamed the mistake on the group, and left the key in the middle of it, effectively wasting everyone's time. I totally can understand now why people would not want to pug keys and instead either run them with friends or their guild members. But I don't want this to be like a ranting type of video where I only talk about the negatives of Mythic Plus, because I want to share my positive experiences too. For one, I really enjoy how the difficulty of the dungeons scales up and rewards good gameplay. I enjoy that Mythic Plus has theoretically infinite scaling and that you can push keystones as high as your heart desires, assuming you have the right group of people to do it with. It felt super rewarding to be doing a fight where there's constant pulsing damage and I'm staggering my healing cooldowns correctly to get the optimal throughput where I'm able to pump out some insane healing numbers and look cool in front of the group. I love that there are certain things about each dungeon which allows every class to have its shining moment. For instance, I love getting to be useful on Brackenhide Hollow and Halls of Infusion because of my poison and disease dispels. I also love that the affixes are something which does change the way that certain dungeons are played and adds slight variety each week to the dungeon routing or how fights are done, and that certain classes can be a huge benefit to the group with specific affixes. I enjoy the fact that you can't lose progression or lose your Mythic Plus score once you obtain it. That's definitely something I enjoy over PvP, is that when you get your progression, you keep it. Sure, you may fail a key and have to do it over again, but you don't lose score because you failed a key. What's crazy is that I find Mythic Plus to be a good game mode at its core, but the problems and negative experiences I've encountered all stem from the community's culture surrounding the game mode. Blizzard has done a lot to cultivate the game and optimize it for players to have fun with the core gameplay experience itself, which is a rare Blizzard W. However, these fundamental issues with the culture surrounding the game are what's keeping players away from wanting to invest their time into it, and I think Blizzard should pivot their focus for a bit to look into these issues. I think the gravest sin comes from these third-party applications, followed by some add-ons which are derivatives of it. Realistically, any player shouldn't need a plethora of add-ons to have an advantage at the game or to be able to know every granular detail about another player's history of the game. It creates this weird culture not present in other games, which is akin to an HR department's applicant tracking system. I think the majority of the players who share my stance would be willing to make exceptions for accessibility-focused add-ons, but the distinction of which would be allowed versus disallowed could easily be muddied, and it seems like Blizzard's already making a push towards adding more accessibility into their game anyways. And I want to reiterate that I believe the game mode of Mythic Plus in itself is still attractive. There's a good reason why so many players choose it over PvP. However, the surrounding barriers to playing the game created by the community, not the game itself, make it not worthwhile for several players to give it a try. So what ended up happening to me? I ended up after a few short weeks somewhere around the 2450 mark for Mythic Plus score. I found myself getting fatigued at the game's problems to where for a period of about 4 to 5 days straight, I would log on, run around Valdrakken for a few minutes, and log off because I didn't feel as much of a desire to play as I had in the first few weeks of doing Mythic Plus. On the 5th day of this drought, I decided to bite the bullet and run an Oldemon key. I needed it for score and figured it was a dungeon I was familiar with. We had a tank with supposedly 3400 score experience. Run in, pull a quarter of the dungeon, take 3 stacks of the chomp debuff from the basilisks, and instantly die without pressing a single defensive cooldown. He then screamed at me in all caps, "Heal me for fuck's sake!" and left the dungeon, thus failing the key for the remaining 4 of us. While an experience like this is something I'm used to easily shaking off because I've been in the PvP scene for 3 years, this in particular solidified for me that I really did not care to continue pushing keystones like I thought I would. I've been playing the game on and off for close to 16 years now, and I think the culture surrounding WoW has evolved into something that's just not enticing for me to want to play anymore. I by no means hate the game and am still in love with Azeroth, the lore, the characters, and mostly enjoyed my time spent playing, but I think its current iteration of the game just isn't for me. I hope that maybe things change in the future and I'll definitely be giving the War Within a try, but for now, I'll have to figure out what I want to do with my channel and how I want to change my brand moving forward. I love the idea of what guilds used to be rather than what they've become, so I may just post videos kind of emulating what that would be like. Playing games, having a good time, talking about life, and getting to know my audience better. I can foster the environment I've always wanted, even if that isn't through the medium of World of Warcraft, because it was historically the communities which were able to make gaming magical. The idea of being able to have fun despite our differences in life experience and make memories together is always something I've dreamed of. Alright, let me stop writing the script before I get too fanatical with myself. But as you may have guessed, I ended up unsubbing from World of Warcraft for the foreseeable future. I went through a tough time trying to figure out how I wanted to deliver this type of video, but decided this would be the best way to do so. So if you're on board to join me wherever we go with our next adventure, it'd really help a ton if you hit subscribe and left a like. Until next time though, this is Moon, signing out.